much for tuning in tonight for our latest public program of 2020, Building a Network, Advancing Natural Areas Management on a National Scale. My name is Tessa O'Connell, and I am the Communications and Public Outreach Manager at the Natural Areas Conservancy. If you're new to our organization, we're a New York City-based nonprofit, and we work really closely with the New York City Parks Department, NYC Parks, and other park conservancies to care for and advance the management of natural areas throughout New York City. So thinking about your forests and your wetlands and grasslands. Tonight, you'll hear from our staff as they highlight the many ways that our organization is starting to expand our reach outside of New York City and collaborate and partner with parks professionals from across the country to advance natural areas management and care. But before we get started, I just want to give a really big thank you to Con Edison. Because of their support to the Natural Areas Conservancy throughout 2020 and previous years, we've been able to offer great public programming like this. So we just are grateful for their support and wouldn't be able to do this event tonight without Con Edison's help. So thank you to them. And in terms of housekeeping, like I mentioned at the start, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are, where you're tuning in from. We definitely want to hear from you. And throughout the event, feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so we will definitely get to your question. And if you are tuning in on Facebook, feel free to leave your questions in the comment section. I will take a look, and we'll definitely get to that during the Q&A session. So that's it for me. I'm going to hand over the event to Clara and Sophie, and thanks again for tuning in.
Thanks so much, Tessa. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to kick off the presentation this evening. I'm Clara Pregitzer with the Natural Areas Conservancy. And in tonight's presentation, we're going to be talking about patterns in urban forestry across the United States. Usually we focus on New York City, but in this presentation, we are going to be focusing on how the Natural Areas Conservancy has been working with others across the country to raise awareness, improve the science and practice of natural areas management, and build a national network. So, like I said, I'm Clara Pregitzer. I'm the Deputy Director of Conservation Science at the Natural Areas Conservancy, and I'll let Sophie Plitt introduce herself.
Thanks, Clara, and good evening, everyone joining us tonight. My name is Sophie Plitt, and I work as the National Partnerships Manager with the Natural Areas Conservancy, and I also work in a dual role with the U.S. Forest Service here in New York City.
And you've already heard from Tessa, and she'll be handling the Q&A at the end. So today we'll be really touching on 3 themes in tonight's presentation. We'll be focusing on urban natural areas beyond New York City and thinking about some trends that we've seen across the US, both in their care and management. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we've been working to create a network of leaders that have been focused on urban natural areas management and care. And then we'll touch on sort of the moment in time and how the pandemic of COVID-19 has impacted urban natural area parkland care and use. And like Tessa said, put your Q&A in the chat, and we look forward to answering questions if we can at the end of tonight's presentation. So we're going to zoom out beyond New York City. This is a beautiful picture of Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, but I wanted to sort of start by zooming out and thinking about urban natural areas in cities across the US. So in this map, you can see in the orange census urban areas and urban clusters. And in the 2 shades of green, you can see forested land. And what you might notice is that along the East Coast and in really heavily urban, in these urban clusters, they're adjacent to forests. And so that's really great because that means a lot of people have close access and are living in close proximity to forest land. But that also means that as urban areas grow and as cities develop, that we might be removing forests to create cities. And so, and our cities are becoming more, or forests adjacent to cities are becoming more fragmented and are being impacted by the consequences of urbanization. And so currently 80% of the US population lives in urban areas. So many people that live in urban areas might be experiencing or exploring forests that are in cities. But urban lands are growing. And so currently we have 68 million acres of urban land in the US, but that's projected to cover and grow to 165 million acres by 2060. And so this interaction between forest land and urban growth is important to understand as our population increases and as we're dealing with land use change across the US. So before we spend the entire presentation talking about urban natural area forests, I wanted to take a moment to just describe exactly what they are. So when you think of an urban forest or an urban tree, you might immediately think of a street tree or a park tree that's planted and managed individually. But natural area forests are different in both the way that they grow and how they're arranged in cities. And so natural area forests are very similar to a forest that you might find in the Catskills, in a rural place. They're a collection of trees. They kind of look and feel like the woods. You might go for a hike in an urban natural area forest. They provide really important habitat value for plants and animals. But they really require different care and different consideration than trees that are growing in a really designed environment. So we like to make sure to sort of call that out at the start. And in New York City, where our organization is really focused and where a lot of my work has been focused, we know quite a bit about natural areas. So we know that there's 6 million trees in natural areas in New York City. And that's about 65% of all of the trees estimated in the whole city. So it's a majority of the trees, but it's a minority or only a quarter of the total tree canopy. So in 25% of the tree canopy in New York City, we have 6 million trees or 65% of the trees. And these forests are actually pretty high quality. So they're threatened from the urban pressures, but their canopy is native dominated and similar in structure and function as forests in rural parts of New York State. And so they really provide a tremendous value. And to give you just a little token of that value, they store 0.83 teragrams of carbon in our natural area forest just in New York City, and that's an estimated 69% of the total carbon stored for all trees in New York City. So they're this really unique, special part of New York City and of the urban forest. And here are just some pictures to give you a visual of what these natural areas look like. So this is Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx in New York City. But kind of zooming out to other cities across the US, here's a forest in the city of Seattle, Washington, a forest in Indianapolis, Minneapolis, and Jacksonville, Florida. And you might think that natural areas are sort of far and few between, but natural areas and natural area parkland are actually a really big resource. And so in a study that I conducted, we found that the majority of parkland in cities, in the 100 most populous cities in the US, are found in natural areas. So 68% of the total parkland in the 100 most populous cities consists of natural areas, and that's compared to designed parkland. So you might think of like a landscaped ball field or a playground or a mowed lawn. But that's a really huge resource. So over 700,000 acres of natural areas in these cities. But these natural areas are declining at a pretty rapid rate. So if you look at that difference between the two dashed lines, you might think that looks pretty small, but 4% of the total natural areas from 2014 to 2019 was lost, and at a rate of about 40,000 acres. So 40,000 acres were lost in these 100 cities in just 5 years. And so natural area land and land use in cities is really dynamic. And to give you an idea of what this might look like on a city by city basis, each of these points here represents one of those 100 most populous cities in the US. And you can see some of the cities are listed there, but if it's above that zero line, that means that those cities actually gained natural area parkland in the last 5 years. And if it's below that line, that means that those cities lost natural area acres in those 5 years. And so you can see that, for example, the city of Houston lost 19,000 acres in 5 years, which is huge. The city of Nashville reportedly lost 8,000 acres, but the city of Detroit gained acres. And so at a city scale, these patterns of land use change in natural area parkland and development are happening at really different scales. And are really contextual to the circumstances in each city. So because of these dynamics, these natural area forests have sort of this paradox where they're both incredibly valuable, but also incredibly vulnerable. So their value of being close to millions and millions of people and providing really important ecosystem benefits, so cooling, stormwater capture, connectivity for plants and animals in that, urban matrix, and then time spent outdoors and an opportunity to get outside and spend time in nature really provides a huge value for city residents that are living in cities and might not have access to the outdoors and might want to go for a walk or take their kids to play. So these natural areas provide a tremendous amount of value, and not just for, the kind of quantitative carbon or cooling or stormwater capture. Those are all important, but they're also incredibly important for people and having a place to have some inspiration and peace and quiet. But because of the urban context, they're so vulnerable. So they have really dynamic historical land uses. There's invasive species that have been brought in and which can cause degradation to the ecological health of the forest. But as we saw in the previous slide, they're also at risk of land conversion and development. And so as these cities grow and people are looking for housing or places, to put the built environment, these open natural areas could be a place to put that. And so they're often at risk of development, but also in the many pressures of the urban environment. So ensuring healthy forests really requires thoughtful and strategic protection, management, and partnership. And so, without management and care, our natural areas might decline due to invasive species, might go away due to development. But with management and protection and care, we can achieve healthy and sustainable forests in cities, which will inherently provide more value to the people and the city as a whole. So we were really interested, our organization became interested in understanding the challenges that organizations face in creating and sustaining healthy forests. And so one of the ways that we did this or began to understand this was through conducting a national survey of practitioners and partners and leaders that were managing natural areas in other cities. And so in 2018, we sent a survey out to over 100 organizations, 100 different organizations, and asked them questions about their goals, their management, and the challenges that they face. And this is just a snapshot of one of the questions we asked them about the challenges that they have in meeting their goals. And we found that many organizations face common challenges. And so limited funding and staff were a huge challenge. 94% of respondents ranked that as one of their top challenges, along with invasive species. So there's both ecological challenges, but also operational and governance challenges. low public awareness of natural areas and limited data about their condition were also challenges that many organizations cited. Uncertainty in management approach was considered to be the least important challenge. So organizations felt more confident in their management approach than some of these other challenges, but yet still 56% of respondents considered it to be important. So there are some lessons here in sort of the common challenges that cities are facing. And we have a report about this that goes into great detail that could be found on our website if you're interested in learning more about this. So that was just one example, a few key takeaways from this national survey. I just mentioned all of the common challenges that cities are facing. Also, cities are conducting management. And a lot of cities are conducting similar types of management. So invasive species removal is something that those forestry practitioners and leaders in cities are really, really leading the country in sort of learning how to deal with invasive species and pests. And so thinking about if there are some best management practices or common approaches that can be summarized at not just the city scale, but a national scale. A lot of cities are really value partnership and are collaborating a lot locally, but because natural areas are typically owned and managed at the city level, there really is not much incentive to coordinate management at a broader regional or national level. So if you think about, for example, the national forest system, which is federally managed and extends across the entire country, that there's a governing body that manages that, but cities are sort of siloed because of their local governments their jurisdiction is really hyper local to the city environment, but there's a lot that cities can learn from one another. So now I'll pass it over to my colleague Sophie Plitt, who is going to introduce us to our more recent work with our 12 city network.
Great. Thank you so much, Clara. So just to build off of Clara's last point, through this survey, we really found that there was a wealth of information and a lot of overlap in the types of challenges that cities across the country were facing when it came to managing natural areas in their own cities. And we really wanted to start to find a way to bring together these scientists, practitioners, thought leaders, and start building a network and sharing that knowledge between them. Next slide.
Sorry, Sophie, no, it's not advancing. Hold on. Got it. There you go.
Great. So the goals of this program are really to elevate awareness at a national level of the importance of these forests, to improve the management of this forest through advancing practice and science, and also to strengthen that community of practice. So building off this survey that asked who's managing forested natural areas and why and what challenges they face, we engaged a group of who we saw as the real leaders in this field, and kind of jump-started a network by inviting teams of practitioners and scientists to join us in New York City in 2019 and begin to share their best practices and really have a conversation around these common themes and just really start talking to each other and networking. So again, we invited 12 cities from all across the country who were doing really amazing work in the field of managing forest and natural areas in their city. So here's a list of the cities that participated, but you can see there's a lot of geographic distribution, and we had large and small cities participating. So everything from Seattle to Billings to Tampa in Florida. And we also had some institutional partners join us, like the US Forest Service, American Forests, and Cities for Forests. And as part of this gathering, we've launched a program here at NAC called the Forests and Cities Program the main goals of which are to really nurture and grow this new burgeoning network that we're helping to create, and also advance the science and practice of managing these forests. So really understanding the dynamics of the forest and how to best care for them and how to really monitor that work in the future. And then finally, really advocating for increased resources and support at both a local and national level for our forests and cities. So before we all got together and met with this new network last year, we really used the data from the national survey to identify some common themes and ideas that really seemed like the central topics that we should cover as a group. So I'll quickly explain sort of the different topics that are at the forefront of this field and sort of have been leading the conversations that we've had as part of this network. So first, we've talked a lot about assessment, which is really developing tools and methods for understanding the current range of conditions or kind of baseline data for both the ecology of the forest and also the social dimension. So who's using it and what people are involved in the work that you're doing. Next is prioritization and planning, which is sort of the act of deciding where to work and why, and where to best invest your resources when you're managing a forested system. The next is organizing and community engagement, which for us really means working to serve and engage all residents, making a case for the action that you're taking in your city, and building local coalitions and regional coalitions to support and steward these forested natural areas. Next is innovations in restoration and management, which are really the best practices and learned experiences and even tacit knowledge that informs management interventions. So what are you actually doing on the ground to manage forests? Next is climate change adaptation. So really considering and finding solutions for the future global climate and understanding maybe the changing trajectories for how forests need to be managed as the climate becomes more unpredictable. Next is monitoring. So that's really the practice of reviewing project performance. So the work that you're doing on the ground, seeing how it's faring, looking at forest condition over time to both inform and adapt your management practices in the future. Next is cross-sector partnerships, which is partnering with folks across scales to really meet regional goals for things like public health and climate change mitigation. And finally is urban land preservation and policy. So kind of speaking back to that point when Clara was talking about the loss of urban natural areas in cities across the US, this is really focusing on the strategies for legally protecting and preserving urban natural areas, which are often seen as sort of a blank slate by planners. So as I mentioned before, when we brought together this wonderful group of practitioners, we centered our work around these 8 themes, and we asked each of the 12 cities to produce 3 to 4 case studies that were centered around these themes and tell us about the work that they were doing on the ground and share it with both our new network and a larger audience of practitioners. So I'm going to give you a little taste of a few of those case studies. And these case studies were also published in a special issue of the journal Cities and the Environment. And I think Tessa can provide a link to the full journal. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these case studies, those are all published and free and available online. So one of the case studies published by our home city, New York, focused on the theme of monitoring. And as I mentioned before, monitoring is really about reviewing your project performance, looking at perhaps sites where you've made management interventions in the past, and monitoring the forest condition over time so that you can inform your management practices in the present and in the future. So New York City Parks has been monitoring the 7,300 acres of forest in New York City since 1984. And as the forests in New York City are managed and restored, the Parks Department's developed a number of really innovative strategies for monitoring these specific sites and even individual plots, but also kind of scaling up to a system-wide monitoring process to understand the overall health and ecological trajectory of New York City's forests. So they've really been looking across scales and times in order to inform the work that they do, and looking at both the trees and the forest. The city of Minneapolis, Minnesota prepared a case study on the topic of assessment. So really trying to understand what condition the forest is currently in so that you can make decisions about how to manage it. And Minneapolis developed a really interesting quality ranking system. So they would use both mapped geographic data that was gathered remotely, and then actually go out into the forest and ground truth that data, and sort of use this dual process to assess the health of forests throughout the city, and then use the results of this assessment to target management where it was needed most. In Seattle, a group called Green Seattle Partnerships, who is a partner of the Seattle Parks and Recreation Department, is using on-the-ground remotely sensed data to better understand how to manage their forests in the light of climate change. So of course, this is related to our climate change adaptation theme. And they're sort of projecting what the climate of their region, their specific ecoregion, is going to look like in years to come, and using that data to help build the program's long-range perspective, while also offering immediate strategies to help natural areas adapt to both existing and anticipated environmental change. So they're sort of triaging on the ground to respond to the current climate, but they're also looking forward 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and trying to manage and plan for forests that can survive in the years to come. And finally, we have a case study from St. Louis, Missouri, under the themes of innovations in restoration and management. So really the action that they're taking on the ground to manage their forests. And maybe some of you have heard of prescribed burns, and that's the practice of, a lot of native forests are actually meant to have some fire within their system, which can help regenerate native species and also keep invasive species out and improve the soil quality. But of course, in cities, you don't have forest fires every so often maintaining the forest. And while it may have seemed a little controversial, the city of St. Louis reached out to residents and worked to build local partnerships to kind of get local communities on board, and make a really safe environment where they could actually do some prescribed burning to help maintain the health of their forests right inside the city. And we're really successful in that application. So that's a little taste of some of the amazing work that cities across the country are doing. And as you can see, those are strategies that can really be shared within this network and adapted by other cities to really help improve their forest management. So that's really supporting our goal of jumpstarting this national network. So the final topic that I'll touch on tonight speaks to our current moment that we are all very aware of and being affected by, COVID-19. So we were really curious on how our new network, these 12 cities, were faring throughout the pandemic, and conducted a survey to learn a little bit more about what was happening across the country. So we conducted the survey in May 2020, and the respondents included public agencies and NGOs from our 12-city network. And these are all people who are leaders in the management of care of urban natural areas. And I'll talk a little bit about the findings below. The one thing I want to mention that I'm sure many of you here in New York City are aware of is that the use of parks has been unprecedented during the pandemic. in New York City, going to a park is sometimes the only activity and respite that people have outside of being in their homes. And as you can see from these many news clippings, folks were using parks more than ever. We had some park managers saying that it was like every day was 4th of July weekend, which is usually their busiest day. And this really made us reflect on the importance of forested natural areas during a pandemic as places that folks could really distance and find some respite and a place to socially distance and also be outdoors and escape their homes for a little while. So what did we find from this survey of our partners? Across the 12 cities, there's been an increase in use of urban natural areas since March 2020 relative to the previous years. And all of these folks observed that residents are seeking out natural areas for local access to nature, a less crowded type of urban parkland as compared to some other types of park uses. And however, very unfortunately, COVID has hit the economy really hard. And despite this increased visitation to natural areas, the pandemic has resulted in an overall decrease in resources available and the ability of staff to care for and maintain urban natural areas across these cities. So overall, we found that a majority, 72% actually, of the organizations that responded have experienced a decreased ability to care for and manage their natural areas. Additionally, partner and volunteer engagement are really critical for caring for these urban natural areas. And these folks really rely on their local partners and volunteers to do some of the hands-on maintenance. But of course, because of COVID, almost all of these volunteer programs and events have been canceled, which led to a really great loss in service performed in the spring of 2020. So we found, 72% of organizations reported that their budget was impacted directly. 94% saw a decrease in their volunteer events, and 72% experienced decreased capacity to care for natural areas. So as you can see in this slide, really only 17% of the organizations said they felt confident in having adequate funding in 2021. So the outlook for the future is not looking good. So sorry to end on such a bleak note. I'm gonna hand it back over to Clara to conclude.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So I hope we left you with a few new pieces of information about urban natural areas and the programs that we run here at the Natural Areas Conservancy. Just to summarize what we talked a little bit about. So I hope you leave this webinar kind of knowing that natural areas are an important resource in cities, but they need management and protection and conservation. And with that, they really need funding and support. And there's a lot of ways to get at that. And we're really excited to begin to sort of think about that. And then secondly, that our organization, has started to try to learn from other cities in the US and also hopefully share some of the work that we've done here in New York City as sort of a hope to raise awareness and sort of come together around the challenges that cities are facing and common challenges. And so how can we kind of come together, band together to protect forests and cities and make them healthier and better supported. And then finally, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really reinforced the importance of nature and the importance of access to green space in cities. And natural areas are a really unique type of green space in cities. And a place that, during a time of crisis or during the pandemic, you might want to get outside and having a healthy natural area to visit, to walk on a well-marked trail, to socially distance and walk with friends. I think has been a really important aspect of natural areas. And so, but they're, you know, they're sort of been a double whammy, I think, for natural areas because they, their care had been underfunded before. And so now that cities are facing these budget cuts and crises, thinking about how do we make sure that when we the pandemic is over, we can come back and make sure that natural areas continue to have care and support for the future. So we'll leave it there, and I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Tessa. I haven't been looking in the chat at all, but Sophie and we have plenty of time to answer a few questions.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Clara and Sophie. We have a few questions that have come in. Definitely a few questions about the case studies that you guys highlighted. So let me just go back up here. Well, before we actually jump into those, we have one question from Kevin from a little bit previous. So Clara, Kevin says, you showed that natural areas decreased in area since 2014, and it looked as if manicured parks increased in that time. Is there a running idea why that might be?
Yes, that's a very perceptive comment. I think, yeah, I think that was our theory. We don't know, we weren't able to sort of track if natural areas were being converted to designed parkland, but that definitely was one of our theories in that paper. So that paper just got accepted in the Journal of Forestry, and happy to share that it'll be on Natural Areas Conservancy's website. But yeah, I think that is definitely possible. Like, you know, let's turn this grassland or meadow that's a natural area into a soccer field. That I definitely think can happen. But there needs to be a lot more kind of granular look at land use change in cities. And there haven't been, one of the things I think we've recognized is there's not common ways cities measure like land uses and granular land use type and land conversion over time. So anyways, yeah, I think that was definitely one of our theories that we wrote about, is that natural areas are being converted to designed parkland.
Great. And I know, Mia, you just submitted a question that was kind of similar, asking about % change in natural area acreage and asking if there's a corresponding publication to that figure. So if we did not answer your question in full, just feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get back to it. But I think, Clara, you covered that as well. So back to those case studies, we have Brittany, and she would love to hear more about the prescribed burning. How exactly do they get people on board? Is that something that other cities are thinking about doing as well?
Hey, Brittany, great question. So first of all, I'll just pop a link in the chat to that particular case study's published article if you want to dive deeper. But I do remember from the presentation and discussion of that case study in our meeting some of the details. So first of all, I'll say prescribed burning is a fairly common forest management practice in more rural areas where there's not as much of a risk of impacting people and kind of getting community buy-in. So that was sort of one of the innovations that St. Louis brought to us. And if I remember correctly, they worked really closely with a Friends of group of the park that they were working in and with the local fire department. And they sort of made it into a bit of an event and put up a lot of signage around the neighborhood explaining when it was happening, what the burn would look like, and what the ecological purpose was. And really got folks excited about it. And they even had people kind of come out and watch and walk by, and they had the local fire department out with trucks sort of staffing the area just in case, and also to sort of show people that everything was under control and it was safe. And in terms of applying this in other cities, I think other cities are thinking about it. I don't know if there's any other cities that are actively doing this right now. Clara, correct me if I'm wrong, but it really had a lot to do with the public buy-in. It's already a tried and true ecological practice. It was just a new thing to do it in an urban area.
I think they also worked with the Department of Health and maybe a local hospital because I think people had expressed concerns for air quality. But yeah, so they were able to sort of get everybody on board. But another thing to note, I think, about the prescribed burning is in that case study, they have some before and after pictures, and they have like it's called a forest stand improvement, and so they were able to basically show that this intervention, you know, was actually a pretty low cost over time to achieve a healthier forest. So kind of with everything in place now, they've been able to successfully do that practice when the weather allows.
That's great. Awesome. So kind of a similar question. Andrew asked it. So Andrew's actually the head of our board at the NAC. So thank you to Andrew for tuning in on a Monday night and asking a good question. So he wants to know which tactics done in other cities would be most applicable to New York City if you had to name a few.
Sure, I can think of a few, and then maybe Sophie, if I don't name some that you thought of, you can answer too. I think during the workshop, one of the things that I think the New York City team, so we had even though we're in New York City, we had a separate New York City team participate in the workshop, and they really, I think, gelled with the city of Seattle, because the city of Seattle at the time of the workshop, we had just released our forest management framework and we're struggling through implementation. While the city of Seattle it was 15 years into their strategic forest management plan. And so they were able to sort of share knowledge and provide a little bit of guidance to our local New York City team on kind of how they measured success, how they structured their implementation and their monitoring and reporting. So I think that was relevant for our New York City team in sort of taking those lessons learned. But I think even the prescribed burn that Sophie just mentioned, there in that theme, which was focused on innovations in restoration and management, there were a lot of new strategies and sort of different tools in the toolbox that people were kind of able to kind of talk through all the technical aspects of, like, well, how would you do a prescribed burn if you had a lot of invasive species, and like, did it work? And really kind of talk through the nitty gritty about how that got done. So I think that the category of innovations in restoration and management was able to bring a little bit of inspiration, I think, to a lot of people who are struggling to manage invasive species, and sort of how to create healthy forests in cities, to provide some interesting examples of how to do that. And then I think vice versa, I think our assessment and monitoring and community engagement approach that were shared a lot in New York City, I think were found useful from other cities. So I think that knowledge exchange was pretty vibrant at that time. And I know some people have stayed in touch too, so hopefully that continues.
Yeah, one more thing to add is that I think New York City is working really hard right now, and NAC is particularly a leader in this, is in local coalition building. So I was just reminded of a case study written by the city of Chicago on their group called the Chicago Regional Trees Initiative, where they brought together folks from different levels of government, botanical gardens, NGOs, and private organizations to really do advocacy and planning across Cook County, which is the county that encompasses Chicago. And so I think that was also a good learning moment for us, and something we're thinking actively about, how to sort of build these partnerships across scales and sectors in New York City.
Awesome. So we'll pivot a little bit to a question about funding. So I can answer a little bit from the NAC's fundraising side of things, and then Clara and Sophie, I'd love to hear, I know from all of your extensive work with the COVID-19 survey, any insight you might have on this as well. So attendee Angel, they asked, I wonder if you have acknowledged more funding opportunities to further the preservation of natural areas, particularly due to the pandemic. So I can highlight the fact that budgets, like Sophie mentioned in her part of the presentation, have been drastically cut in New York City. The Parks Department budget, I believe, was cut by 14%. Which is a lot when you look at their operating budget. So it definitely is putting a strain on the city and their ability to do things like forest management or even just picking up trash. And they've had to rely a lot on park conservancies and volunteers to help kind of pick up the slack. So it is a little bit depressing from that side of things. But from a collaborations partnership standpoint, the NAC's been really lucky to engage in this exciting partnership called the Parks and Open Space Coalition. So a lot of park groups from throughout New York City have come together we launched a report similar to our COVID-19 report, but for New York City specifically. And then a lot of great funders have kind of rallied together to create a green fund and try to help fill some of the funding gaps that the nonprofits are experiencing. Since a lot of the work that we do at the NAC or other park conservancies like Prospect Park Alliance, Central Park Conservancy, et cetera, they help complement New York City parks and can help pick up the slack if they have budget cuts and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of efforts in the city. I'll make a shameless plug. It's year-end giving time. And we are always so grateful for our supporters of the NAC. Your donations this year will really go so far and will mean so much to our organization because, like everybody during COVID-19, times are not the easiest right now. So that's another way if you wanted to pitch in and help your local park groups or just support your parks. A donation this giving season is definitely a great way to make an impact. So Sophie and Clara, what do you think about COVID-19 and impact on more of the national scale funding?
Yeah, thanks for that response. I think, I don't know, I think cities are really struggling. I think we asked that question in May. So like kind of looking back now, I feel like it was pretty early on in the pandemic. And I think a lot of, even though cities, only 17% felt confident about their budget moving forward, I think Sophie and I have discussed, it'd be interesting to ask them now in December or January, kind of how that panned out and kind of what strategies are sort of forming or bubbling in some of these other cities. I think a lot of those cities are well connected and I think, kind of scrapping around the same way we are here in New York City to try to figure out how to fill some of those funding gaps. And I think one of the things, we've thought about is kind of reaching back out and kind of learning more about, now that it's been 8-9 months, kind of how has your budget cycle been realized and kind of what strategies are coming up to kind of deal with some of these budget cuts, and is it through volunteerism, is it through innovative funding or partnerships? So I don't have like a direct answer for how some of these other cities are dealing with this, but we've kind of just chatted with them a little bit here and there and heard that things have been hard like they are here.
Yeah, definitely understandable. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit back to some of the technical stuff you guys were talking about a little bit earlier about land acreage. So Jacqueline was wondering, the cities that added acreage, what was the process behind that? Was it land purchase or removal from tax rolls? Is that Detroit? Any insight would be appreciated for her curiosity.
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that for every single city. I think the crazy thing is that these numbers are self-reported. So it was in partnership with the Trust for Public Land. So there's no common way cities are measuring or mapping natural areas across the US. So we have our natural area map here in New York City. Detroit has their own way of measuring and mapping that. Seattle has their own way, Los Angeles has their own way. So I think I'm fascinated by this question and by these like changes. And I think it's something that we want to dig in a little bit further because like how can you protect land if you don't know that you have it or you don't have it measured or you don't have it mapped? But so to kind of more directly answer your question, I think, yeah, I've been, thinking about this for the cities that gained a lot of acreage, and I think there are shrinking cities. So Detroit's a shrinking city. You know, there were, I think, over 1 million people that lived there at one point. I'm from Michigan, and you know, they lost like, yeah, more than half of their population. And so I think St. Louis is a shrinking city. So even though overall urban land is expanding, there are a lot of cities that are shrinking. And what happens to vacant lots and what happens to houses, and sort of how does that get converted to parkland maybe, or get converted to vacant land over time. And so I'll just add one thing that's interesting about New York City is I did a historical land use classification of all of our natural areas that currently exist. And the majority of them that are forest today were not forest in 1924. So in the course of, 90 years, we've seen forests grow in New York City in areas that were previously landscaped areas or previously built areas. So urban land and urban land use, even in a city like New York, is really dynamic and changes over time. So I think I don't know all of the reasons why we saw increases or decreases on a city basis, but I think having this sort of national pattern, we can, I think, start to maybe build a case to say, hey, what if we like used remote sensing in the same way to measure natural areas, and thought about conservation in a common way across cities and land protection.
Great. So let's do probably 2 more questions since we're getting close to 7. We have one coming in from, I'm going to try to say Pallavi. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. You have a great question about Indigenous population. And so they're wondering, how involved were Indigenous populations in conversations on natural area conservation and restoration efforts in the different case studies? Were there any conflicts and perspectives offered from them versus urban populations living next to these natural areas?
Yeah, we did not really address this at all in our case studies. But I know that some of our city partners have been working with local tribal communities, and so I think, and that's something that has been brought up in the context of sort of thinking about the history of forests and cities and sort of whose land are we on. But it was not addressed in any of our case studies directly.
Yeah, it was a pretty specific question, but I figured, well, something to chat about.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. And
yeah.
I think, yeah, but we didn't address that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see one more. This is a little bit specific for you, Sophie. Can you talk about your work with the Forest Service and what the Forest Service is doing in these different cities?
Oh, sure. So I'll start by saying sort of the way the Forest Service is involved in our network is really as a supportive thought partner. So the Forest Service National Office really does support a lot of scientific research and programming when it comes to providing resources for forest managers at a national scale. And because our organization has sort of taken on the role of helping to jumpstart the first network of natural areas managers in cities, they've been a leading partner in really supporting that work and helping to amplify our research. And then in terms of sort of the Forest Service is part of the USDA, and they own, or the US government and all of us own public lands that they manage, but they also, see it as part of their mission to really advance both social and ecological science to support the work we do. So for example, our local field station in New York City is really active in sort of studying the social dimension of how people are connected to and stewarding the local green and blue spaces in their cities. And they've launched a research endeavor over the past more than 10 years, 13, 15 years, called STU-MAP, which is an acronym for the Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project. And it's a way of studying the entire network of folks that are working to manage and advocate for and care for all the green spaces across the city, and really understand the dynamics of how those people get involved, where they work, how they interact and network with one another and with government organizations. And so part of the work that I'm doing is also bringing that research to other places across the country besides just New York City. But that's just one way that they're sort of supporting the understanding and science of managing urban green spaces.
Awesome. I'm myself here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. I think we covered a lot. So thank you, Clara and Sophie. This is such a great and engaging conversation talking about, so many timely topics. And thank you everybody who attended for your awesome questions and your engagement tonight. I put a couple of links in the chat right now. So our website is naturalareasnyc.org. And if you do backslash national, you'll be able to access all of the reports and things that Sophie and Clara talked about tonight. And then I also linked to our YouTube page in case you're interested in seeing any of the recordings from our previous events. We've done a lot of different topics throughout the summer and fall. So that's definitely a fun thing to check out if you're interested. Otherwise, we want to give another thank you to Con Edison for helping to support our organization. And thank you again to Clara and Sophie and everybody who tuned in. Have a great night, and we will see you in 2021.
Thank you all.
Bye.